Today we're talking about early neoclassical style, and this is going to cover both France and England. There were 9 factors responsible for the early French neoclassicism style. The first were the traditionalists, Blondel and Gabriel, and they looked to the classicism of the 17th century as their source of inspiration. Blondel was a great admirer of Francois Mansart, who was the leader of the 17th century French classicism in architecture, and was influential in his roles as the director of the École des Arts, the professor at the Academy of Architecture, and was also the author of Architecture Francois. Gabriel was fully entrenched in the French classicism and was also influenced by Mansart. Gabriel designed the Petit Trianon for Louis XV, who had it built for Madame du Pompadour. The second influential factor were that students studied in Rome, and some received their education at the Academy of Architecture. Prix de Rome winners from the Academy of Architecture in Paris began to study at the French Academy in Rome, and these students studied firsthand the remains of Roman antiquity. The third thing was excavations of the ancient cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii, and they had much influence at this time. The fourth factor was the interest in classic purism by Madame de Pompadour, who was influential through her personal design decisions and her political appointments affecting the direction of the arts. She actually was able to secure her brother, Abel Poussin, as Minister of the Arts, and he in turn stressed classical antiquities. The fifth factor was Soufflot and Piranesi, who looked to the revival of the classics based on archaeological knowledge. Soufflot's approach was to base his designs on individual investigations of antiquity and on recent excavations. Artists who depict ancient Roman monuments in imaginary settings and in ruined scenes influenced Piranesi. It was his belief that archaeological ruins could inspire creativity. The sixth influencing factor was the moral basis that permeated in the 18th century, also known as the Age of Enlightenment. It emphasized plain living, giving attention to open air and rural pursuits, and this translated into simplicity in architectural forms, the introduction of rustic objects, and stress on informal gardening. The seventh influencing factor was publications dealing with the reliance on Roman and Greek antiquity. The major influence was Johann Wickelmann, a German classical archaeologist and historian of ancient art, whose History of Ancient Art presented the idealized version of Greek art and architecture. The publication of Where's the Architecture by Marie-Joseph Payer enlightened the public on Roman antiquity and introduced the colonnade, the emphasis on symmetry, and circular rooms. The eighth factor was Palladianism, the classical ideal of the Whig Party, which was a symbol for the power of the landed aristocracy whose residences were central to the country estates. And the ninth and final factor was the 7 Years' War, which was from 1756 to 1763, and it had an impact on the economy. France lost its American colonial possessions to Britain, and this determined the amount of building activity that was the culmination of the neoclassicism of the Louis XVI style. The early French neoclassic style grew from opposition of the Rococo style, and Rococo was criticized for its excesses, asymmetry, and perceived disorderliness, all things the neoclassic style was not. In England, the same factors held true. There was a desire for ordered arrangements and simplicity. During this period, the people established a preference for linear, the symmetrical, and low relief rather than the plasticity typical of the Baroque and Rococo style. They related ratios of rooms and entire buildings to music. They correlated musical chords, A to B to A, to the proportions of the room. Influences in this style were Italian Renaissance, the travel and study of Europeans who were influential architects and designers in England, the study of archaeological excavations, publications, and the Industrial Revolution. Important people in this time period were Inigo Jones, who studied Palladio, an Italian architect, and he introduced the English to Palladianism. Early in the 18th century, Colin Campbell, William Kent, and Lord Burlington led the English Palladian revival, although it was confined to domestic buildings. And then there was Robert Adam. His father was a Scottish architect whose style was based on Palladianism. He was central to the Neoclassical movement. He was an imaginative designer, more in interiors than exteriors. He combined Neo-Gothic exteriors with more classic interiors. He visited ruins of the palace fortress of Diocletian, who was a Roman emperor, and collected enough information to reconstruct the building. He then published The Ruins of the Palace of Diocletian at Spoleto in 1765. He used picturesque drawings to replace wooden models as a way to present ideas. Designers at this time were not forced to comply with rules, and there was a new attitude about antiquity, and one was models. He was the first person who does not build a model, but describes graphically through drawings. Robert Adam and William Chambers were responsible for altering country residences of the interior, exterior, and in restoration. Prefabricated parts became available due to machine processes and influenced interior stucco duro or moulu, papier-mâché, carpets, and wallpaper. And agricultural methods improved in the late 18th century, which caused an increase in income, allowing for people to construct, update, and renovate country estates. Spatial characteristics were impacted by reliance on Roman antiquity and by contemporary concepts that allowed more freedom in planning and design. They moved away from formality of the Baroque and Rococo period, focusing on subtlety and constraint. Imperial Roman baths influenced contrasting room shapes and incorporating rounded corners and circular rooms and circular staircases. There were harmonic proportions that were key in beauty, although Robert Adam and others questioned the rules, which led to greater latitude and creativeness when referencing Roman antiquity. The Adam brothers introduced the concept of movement in Volume 1 of their works of the Works in Architecture of Robert and James Adam, and also redesigned gardens of Trianon for Marie Antoinette, created an interest in informal gardening. There are 3 country homes which I'll mention that were the similar style seen throughout this time period. First is Kendleston, which was inspired by Lord Burlington's Palladianism. The architects were Matthew Beddingham, James Payne, and Robert Adam, and it's composed of a square central block with 4 pavilions joined by quadrant quarters, and the northeast pavilion was a place for family, whereas the northwest pavilion was the place for the kitchen and servants. Here you can see the exterior a cut of the model of the actual interior, and an image from the interior colonnade portion. The second is the Sion floor plan. Sion was built by Robert Adam. He was in charge of the reconstruction of this space. And Adam makes use of the apsidal ends, one oval and one rectangular. And he also utilized the Doric order within the hall. He makes use of columns to reduce the shape of the anteroom from rectangular to square. And here we can see another one that incorporates a rounded shape. And the third is Doddington. The features of this home become more common in the early 19th century. The planning reflected less formal entertaining and wanted easy access from the main floor to the landscape. The basement here was completely underground, which allowed for attainment of the ultimate goals, which were the first, to have the main rooms at ground level, which opened the house to the garden by use of French windows, and the second was to incorporate a servant's wing, also at ground level. The materials and decorative techniques commonly seen during this period were brought about because of advanced technology. New materials that were incorporated were either or representative of plaster, stucco, scagliola, paintings or moulu, papier-mâché, textile, wallpaper, and carpet. Plaster walls were very common and seen in middle-class homes, and the technique of making scagliola was perfected during the late 18th century. It was formed to imitate marble in areas such as columns, floors, tabletops, and pedestals. Paintings were significant in decoration, especially for ceilings. Or moulu, which is made of gilded bronze, was used as an application to furniture as well as an accent to interior elements, including chimney pieces and doors. The wallpaper was machine printed, hand painted, or hand blocked. Papier-mâché was a substitute for stucco ornamentation on the ceiling and some moldings. Adams incorporated carpets to coordinate and echo the ceiling design onto the floor. For the floors, the most frequently used materials were wood in a natural state, brick, or stone. Parquet floors were laid in both simple and complex designs, and floor designs would often echo the ceiling to create more of a harmonious interior. Carpets were more commonly seen with the new technology and advancements happening. Carreau d'octagonals, a floor design consisting of black diamonds positioned at the junctures of bigger intersecting squares, is now seen. Looking at walls, plaster replaced wood paneling in the dado. Above the dado was usually treated with wallpaper, textiles, or plaster and designs in stucco. Adams' early interiors made use of columns, and they were important in the way space is articulated, proportions are visually altered, and spatial drama is attained through movement. Page 313 shows a great example of this. Looking at windows and doors, the bay windows started to be used in townhouses. Semi-hexagonal or curved bay windows were used beginning in mid-18th century. Double-hung windows were often the most commonly used. Heavy textiles could be incorporated around windows, and often they would extend to the floor. 6-panel doors were common. Painted fir or pine was what was most often seen. Panels were enhanced with frames of neoclassical detail, and a single leaf door or double door was seen for grand rooms. And doors would sometimes curve to fit the contours of the room. Here in this slide you can see many styles that were influenced by Palladianism. The Palladianism often had the door with side lights and a rounded overhead transom. Mostly flat ceilings were seen during this time, with an occasional coved or transition from wall to ceiling. Ornamentation was anywhere from simple to highly complex, and the most common material was plaster. The arrangement of subordinate panels around a central, more dominant unit of design replaced large ceilings. The coffered ceiling with geometric compartments was a popular enrichment. Carved wood was sometimes applied for ornamentation, but it was usually accomplished through plasterwork. Common houses usually utilized wood for their staircases, but more grand houses used stone. Usually the stairs were simple and elegant. Several materials were often combined to create the staircases. The amount of space usually determined the plan of the staircase. Curved and circular stairs were used in tight spaces. Where there was more space, the stairs began with one central flight to a landing and then divided into two. Wrought iron was now incorporated into the balusters and balustrades. Looking at the materials and construction techniques for furniture, solid mahogany was used for the first time, and also now they're seeing mahogany veneering. Japanning, vernis glamoisé, vernis martin, pietra dura, insertion of porcelain are all common techniques applied to furniture. Adam typically used solid mahogany, but in the later part of the century, satinwood and hairwood were seen, and marquetry became popular again as a decorative technique. In this slide you can see many examples of drawings of typical furniture of both Hepplewhite and Robert Adam. Around 1770, Adam's furniture was painted to color coordinate with the plasterwork schemes of the room. Marquetry and painting would be applied to the same pieces. Paintings of figures were set in oval or circular medallions, and paint was applied directly to the surface or onto copper sheets and set into surfaces of individual pieces. Ormulu mounts and neoclassical ornament were used as the edging for shelves, capitals, decorative swags, and friezes. And gilding was used on furniture in many rooms, but especially important for the drawing room pieces. And here you can see ormulu mounts on the edges of the armrest for the chair. Louis XVI furniture style was also seen during this time, and his furniture is characterized by straight lines, simplicity, and well-defined joints. The seats were often unattached to the back, with a curved back that enveloped the sitter. It characteristically had curved arms with manchettes or arm pads, and had fluted legs that ended with a box filled with a rosette. And this slide are some other examples of Louis XVI seating. The bergère, which is an enclosed armchair. The chauffouse, which is basically designed to be placed close to the fire, which is why it has that very low seat. And the third is the canapé, which is basically like a sofa. In this slide you can see several examples of Robert Adam chairs. Adam's design and furniture showed his interest in the Gothic style, which you can see an example in your book on page 322. Later he began to introduce Rococo details with neoclassical motifs on seat rails like the Sphinx, foliated scrolls, and anthemoine. Chairs with thin, tapering, fluted legs were also commonly seen. He was probably influenced by the Louis XVI style for his medallion back chairs. The difference between the Adams and Louis XVI is the English splay the rear legs, whereas the French do not. His furniture style was adopted more than any other seat furniture maker. Looking at tables, he coordinated his tables with ornamental schemes. They were usually only decorative tables. They were light in scale, rectangular or sometimes semi-oval. Legs were straight and tapered and could be either round or square. Marquetry and painted designs were his primary ways of ornamentation. His storage pieces were also semicircular, hollow, and decorated with marquetry. Marquetry medallions often contained images of Venus or Cupid, and they would also coordinate with the room interior. Here you can see several examples of mirrors. Mirrors were prominent in Adams' interior designs. Oval and tripartite, which is where he used 3 together, were his most common designs. Tripartite looked almost palladium with a large center and 2 flanking sides. Oval mirrors were surrounded by neoclassical motifs. And in this slide you can see a couple examples of his beds. And his style can be identified by the classical Roman motifs like the framed medallion, faces, and urns, as well as the painted ornamentation like swags and ribbons. Now I'm moving over to Hepplewhite. Hepplewhite's chairs had backs that were shield, oval, and heart-shaped. The different motifs were used on the splat inside the shield, including festoons of draperies, classical urns, rosettes, prints of whale feathers, and other things. The legs were straight and square or rounded in sections. Legs were ornamented by painting, carving, or fluting. Because of the proportions of the trapezoid seat, the rear legs were usually close together and often had outward turned feet. Oval chair backs were often filled with geometric designs, sometimes the prints of whale feathers. Heart-shaped backs were formed by 3 interlacing ovals stemming from a pointed base, and all the chairs were lightly scaled with no stretcher and had upholstery over the seat rail. Looking at his tables, the sideboard table was both with or without drawers, and he also designed side tables, console tables, and pier tables, for which he owed a great deal to Adam for inspiration. His storage pieces had straight or bowed fronts with graduating drawers, and often used a dressing table with the top drawer for toiletry items and a hinged mirror. The ornamentation was in the form of stringing and banding. And with his beds, he often incorporated a 4-poster bed. The posts were fluted above a vase-shaped lower section, and legs were tapered and squared in section with spade feet. And finally, their Sheraton style. The Sheraton seats, the chairs were lightly scaled and had straight lines. They used the shield back also, but preferred more rectilinear forms. The central splat was formed by the back uprights and contained motifs like the urn, and sometimes the splat was framed by columns and sometimes a raised center section of the back. He favored tapered round sectioned legs, and seats were trapezoidal shaped or round. Sometimes japanning was used and ornamented with colorful flowers. He designed many tables, including the Pembroke table, dining, sideboard, sofa tables, and so on. The Pembroke was used for serving meals, and it had 2 drop leaves and a drawer set under the fixed table surface. He created a Harlequin Pembroke, which concealed compartments to place accessories. And he gave special attention to work tables, which served many purposes. He also created many storage pieces. Bookcases and secretary bookcases were tall and designed in 2 tiers, and the upper had 2 glazed doors, and the lower tier varied according to functional purposes. Here you can just see several examples of different storage pieces that he designed, incorporating flat front or curved front, storage pieces above or not. And this concludes our lecture on Neoclassicism.